Here is something that will rearrange something in you if you let it. The person who pulled away from you, the one who created distance so consistently it started to feel like their personality, they tried to stop. Not to stop seeing you, not to stop the relationship, though maybe that too. They tried to stop feeling what they feel about you. They ran the strategy. They deployed every psychological tool available to someone whose entire attachment system was built around the project of not needing anyone. They minimized, they rationalized, they found fault, they created space, they told themselves a story about why this wasn't that serious, why you weren't that irreplaceable, why the feeling would pass if they just gave it enough room to cool. And something inside them refused. That refusal is what this is about. Before anything else gets said, something needs to be acknowledged. The fact that someone's love for you persisted despite their efforts to dismantle it, that is not a simple comfort. It does not automatically make everything okay. It does not erase the confusion or the distance or the particular loneliness of being loved by someone who seemed, from the outside, to be doing the opposite. Love that cannot express itself cleanly. Love that gets filtered through a defense system built for survival rather than connection. That love is real, and it is also genuinely painful to be on the receiving end of. Both of those things are true simultaneously. And holding both of them, without collapsing into either pure hurt or pure hope, is the emotional task this conversation is going to ask of you. You are capable of it. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. To understand what it means for an avoidant to try to stop loving someone, you have to first understand the relationship between avoidant attachment and emotional control. Because for most people, the idea of trying to stop loving someone sounds either dramatic or impossible, something you might attempt in the acute pain of a breakup. Maybe, but not something that operates as a quiet, ongoing background process in a functioning relationship. For the avoidant, it is exactly that, a quiet, ongoing background process. The deactivation of feeling is not something they do in crisis moments only. It is a continuous project, a maintenance system, something that runs almost automatically because it was constructed so early, practiced so consistently, reinforced so thoroughly by every relationship they've ever been in, that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like how they are. The system works by generating distance between the person and their own feeling. Not the dramatic distance of someone who is obviously shutting down, though that happens too, but a more subtle, continuous management of emotional temperature, keeping the feeling at a level that can be held without becoming threatening, without becoming the kind of need that makes you vulnerable to loss, without crossing the threshold where caring about someone becomes something that could genuinely devastate you if it ended. That management is exhausting in a way the avoidant will rarely admit, even to themselves, because it requires ongoing vigilance, constant subtle effort, the perpetual low-grade work of keeping the feeling from growing past the point they've decided is safe. And then you came along, and something happened that their system was not prepared for. The feeling didn't stay at the managed level, it kept growing, past the threshold they'd set, past the point where the usual tools were sufficient. They tried the standard approaches, finding reasons to be less invested, amplifying your flaws in their mind, creating physical or emotional space to let the intensity cool, reminding themselves of all the ways relationships tend to end badly, all the ways needing someone tends to produce loss. None of it worked the way it was supposed to. The feeling kept coming back. In the quiet moments, in the unguarded ones, in the spaces between the managing and the maintaining, you were there, not as a problem to be solved. As a presence that had somehow gotten past the part of them that was supposed to keep presences from mattering too much. And that is not a small thing. For someone whose entire psychological architecture has been oriented around emotional self-protection, having a feeling that resists all the protection mechanisms, that is, in the most literal sense, unprecedented. There is a specific experience that avoidants have, which they almost never speak about directly, that is worth naming here because it explains so much of the behavior that looks, from the outside, like inconsistency or cruelty. It is the experience of being ambushed by their own feeling, of being in a moment, ordinary, unremarkable, not particularly charged, and suddenly feeling something about you so acutely that it cuts through all the management at once. It might be triggered by something as small as a sound, a phrase you used once that appears in a completely unrelated context, the quality of light at a particular time of day that you are both present for. Something that should not carry weight but carries enormous weight because the nervous system has indexed it, filed it under you, and retrieves it without asking permission. In those moments, the avoidant does not feel the managed, carefully rationed version of what they feel for you. They feel the whole thing, unfiltered, And the whole thing is, in most cases, significantly larger than what they have allowed themselves to acknowledge. Significantly larger than what they communicated to you. Significantly larger than what their behavior would ever have suggested. And then the management kicks back in. The distance reasserts itself. The tools redeploy. And from where you were standing, it might have looked like nothing happened. Like they were fine. Like the feeling, if it existed at all, was not particularly urgent. But something happened. The whole thing happened, and they spent the next hours or days quietly recovering from the ambush of their own heart. This is the part where the question of why matters enormously. Not why do avoidants do this in the general, attachment theory sense. You likely understand that by now. But why specifically does the love persist when they are actively trying to manage it out of existence? What is it about certain connections that defeats the deactivation strategy so thoroughly that the avoidant finds themselves, repeatedly, ambushed by feeling they were certain they had handled? The answer has several layers, and each one is worth sitting with. The first layer is simple and almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The love persists because it is real. Because genuine feeling, the kind that is rooted in actual knowing, in having been present with another person through enough moments to accumulate a real history, does not respond to the deactivation strategy the way a surface attraction does. Surface attractions can be managed. They can be cooled by distance, replaced by novelty, dissolved by the intellectual decision that this is not the right fit. But genuine feeling, the kind that has had the chance to root, that is not accessible to those tools in the same way. And you were known by them. Not completely, not in the way you deserved or needed, but genuinely. In the unguarded moments, in the conversations that went somewhere neither of you planned, in the ordinary accumulation of time spent in each other's presence, they knew you. And knowing someone, truly knowing them, creates a kind of attachment that the managed defended self cannot fully reach and cannot fully undo. The second layer is more complex. The love persists because something about you specifically got underneath the usual defense perimeter, not through force, not through pursuit, not through being so consistently available that they eventually relaxed, but through some quality of who you are that the avoidance system encountered and could not categorize as a threat in the usual way. This is different for every avoidant and every connection. But there is usually something, a quality of how you saw them, a moment of genuinely accurate perception on your part, a time when you understood something about them that they have not articulated and did not expect to be understood. That created a crack in the architecture, a point of entry that bypassed the evaluation system. And once something genuine got through, once the feeling had a foundation that existed inside the walls rather than outside them, the deactivation strategy was working against its own interior rather than defending against an external approach. That is a fundamentally different situation. You cannot defend against something that is already inside. And the love, having established itself inside the walls, became something they were managing within themselves, rather than protecting themselves from on the outside. That internal quality made it persistent in a way that external feeling simply is not. The third layer is the one that requires the most honesty to examine. The love persists, in part, because the avoidant allowed it to, not consciously, not as a deliberate choice made with full awareness of what they were permitting. But somewhere in the architecture of their defended self, a door was left unlocked. A part of them, the part that still, despite everything, wants to be known and loved and close to someone without it destroying them, that part recognized something in you and made a quiet, private decision not to lock the door all the way. And that decision was not nothing. For someone whose entire relational history has been organized around keeping the doors locked, for someone who has spent decades perfecting the art of being present without being reachable, the act of leaving one door unlocked is in its own quiet way an act of enormous courage. They may not have called it that. They may not have experienced it as a choice at all. But it was. And what came through that door, once it was left open, the feeling that built in the space between their defended self and the genuine connection you offered, that is what refused to be dismantled. That is the love that survived every attempt to manage it out of existence, because it had been, on some level, invited. Now here is where this becomes something more than an explanation of their psychology. Because you have been living on the other side of all of this, you have been experiencing, from the outside, a love that existed at a volume you were not allowed to hear, a feeling that was real and large and persistent, and was simultaneously being managed, deflected, rationed, and expressed in ways so indirect and so qualified that you could be forgiven for questioning whether it existed at all. And that experience, of being loved at a volume you couldn't hear, has its own particular damage. It doesn't look like the damage of being unloved. It's quieter than that, more confusing. It manifests as a persistent uncertainty about your own perceptions, a habit of second-guessing what you felt in the moments when the connection was undeniable. A tendency to dismiss your own experience of being genuinely seen and genuinely loved because the behavior surrounding it so often contradicted it. You started to wonder if you were making it up, if you were projecting, if the warmth you felt in the unguarded moments was real, or just what you needed to believe was real. That doubt, that erosion of trust in your own experience, is one of the quieter but more lasting costs of loving someone whose love for you was genuine, but whose capacity to express it was severely limited. Your perceptions were accurate. The warmth was real. The moments of genuine connection were not projections. You were not inventing something that wasn't there. What was there was real. It was just being filtered through a system that could not let it move freely. And the gap between what was felt and what was expressed was not a measure of the feeling's authenticity. It was a measure of the distance between the avoidant's inner world and their capacity to inhabit it openly. That distinction matters for you, not in a way that necessarily changes what was possible between you. Not as an argument for return or for hope in the conventional sense, but as a restoration of something that the confusion and the distance may have quietly taken from you, your trust in your own knowing. Your confidence in your own experience, the right to say, I felt something real there, and have that be true, regardless of what the outcome was or is. You felt something real, they felt something real. The something real was not enough, not because it wasn't large enough, but because the container it existed in was not yet built to hold it. The love was present. The capacity to live inside that love without dismantling it was not. And those are two different problems. One belongs to the feeling, the other belongs to the work that precedes being able to sustain it. There is a moment that many people who have loved an avoidant describe, sometimes months later, sometimes years, where they receive confirmation of what they already knew. A conversation, a mutual friend's observation, the avoidant themselves finally saying something honest about what they felt. And the confirmation, when it arrives, does not feel triumphant. It feels like something between vindication and grief. Because now you know for certain that what you felt was real and mutual. And you also know for certain that it wasn't enough to change anything. That the love existed and the limitation existed alongside it, and the limitation won, not because the love was small, but because the internal infrastructure to sustain it simply wasn't there. That specific grief, the grief of confirmed mutual feeling that still didn't produce the outcome it deserved, is one of the most particular and least discussed forms of loss available. It doesn't fit the standard narrative of heartbreak. It resists the usual consolations. You can't tell yourself they didn't care. You can't locate a clean villain. You can't even fully locate a clean mistake. What you have instead is the complicated adult reality of two people whose feelings for each other were genuine and whose capacity to translate those feelings into a sustainable connection was unequal. And you are allowed to grieve that with the full weight it deserves, without rushing to the lesson, without converting the pain into productivity before it has had the chance to simply be pain. The grief of unequal capacity is a strange thing to carry, because it doesn't have a clean object. You can't grieve the loss of their love. The love was there. You can't grieve being unwanted. You were wanted. What you are grieving is something more abstract and in some ways more devastating than either of those things. You are grieving the gap. The space between what was felt and what was possible. Between the feeling that refused to be dismantled and the life that feeling could not quite build. That gap has a weight to it that is difficult to explain to people who haven't lived inside it. From the outside, it can look like you're holding on too long. Like you're refusing to accept something that should, by now, be accepted. But the holding on is not irrationality. It is the natural response to a loss that doesn't have clean edges, that keeps presenting itself as almost resolved and then opening again. Because the love was real. And real things don't disappear just because the circumstances that contained them have changed or ended or proven themselves insufficient. You have to let the grief be specifically what it is, not a generalized heartbreak, not the loss of a relationship in the broad sense, but the precise, particular grief of having been loved genuinely by someone who could not live inside that love without dismantling it. Who tried repeatedly and with genuine effort, or as much genuine effort as their system would allow, to stop feeling what they felt, and failed. And then, in the failure, still could not find a way to let the feeling become what feelings between people are supposed to eventually become. Something shared, something mutual, something that builds rather than retreats. The trying to stop and the failing to stop and the still not being able to fully stay, that three-part experience, which they lived internally and you experienced as the maddening inconsistency of their behavior, that is its own kind of tragedy, not the dramatic tragedy of cruelty or betrayal. The quiet tragedy of limitation, of someone who contained something real and could not find a way to let it out without the whole system threatening to collapse. Here is something worth understanding about the internal experience of an avoidant who is losing the battle against their own feeling. It does not feel, from the inside, the way it looks from the outside. From the outside, it can appear as indifference, as someone who is fine, as someone who has moved on cleanly or never been that invested to begin with. The composed exterior, the ability to function, the absence of visible distress, all of that reads as evidence of low attachment. But inside, the experience is frequently the opposite. The avoidant who is trying to stop loving you and failing is not calm. They are managing. There is a significant difference between those two things. Calm is the absence of internal turbulence. Managing is the continuous, exhausting work of containing turbulence that will not resolve. And the avoidant, having built a lifetime of expertise in the appearance of calm, is often extraordinarily good at making management look like equanimity. What is actually happening is a kind of internal weather that never fully clears. Thoughts of you that arrive without invitation and resist dismissal. A recurring quality to the feeling that the deactivation strategy keeps addressing and keeps failing to permanently resolve. Moments of apparent peace that are interrupted unexpectedly by the full weight of what they are trying not to feel. And through all of it, the maintenance of an exterior that communicates none of this. That says, through posture and tone and the practiced normalcy of their continued life, I am fine. I have this handled. This is not the emergency it actually is. The performance of fine is one of the most isolating experiences available to a human being. Because when you perform fine, you cut yourself off from the very support that might help you process what you're actually experiencing. You cannot reach for comfort without revealing that comfort is needed. You cannot admit the size of the feeling without dismantling the architecture of self-sufficiency that has been your primary coping mechanism since childhood. And so the feeling stays inside, unspoken, unwitnessed, unprocessed, growing in the dark with nowhere to go. And you, on the other side of their performed fine, were interpreting the performance as the reality. Were adjusting your own behavior in response to an exterior that had no reliable relationship to the interior. Were trying to read a text that was written in a language specifically designed not to be read. That is not a failure of your perception. That is the inevitable result of trying to know someone through what they allow you to see, when what they allow you to see has been carefully edited to conceal the most important content. The question that tends to surface at this point, and it deserves a direct, honest engagement rather than a sidestep, is whether any of this changes anything. Whether knowing that they tried to stop and couldn't, that the love was real and persistent and larger than what they expressed, whether any of that matters in a practical sense, whether it should change how you feel, or what you do, or what you allow yourself to hope. The honest answer is that it matters enormously, and it changes almost nothing about the external situation. Because the internal reality of their feeling, however large, however persistent, however thoroughly it defeated their efforts to dismantle it, that internal reality does not automatically translate into the capacity to be a present, available, consistently loving partner. Feeling and functioning are different things. The love being real does not mean the relationship was sustainable. The feeling refusing to be stopped does not mean the person was able to stop running the system that kept the feeling from ever fully landing between you. What it does change is the story you tell yourself about what happened, about what you were to them, about whether you were seen and wanted and genuinely felt. That story matters, not as consolation prize, as truth, as the accurate account of a real experience that you are owed, regardless of the outcome. You were genuinely felt. Let that be a complete sentence for a moment, not a preamble to something else, not the first half of a but. You were genuinely felt by someone whose entire system was organized around not feeling people that completely. You got past something in them that very few people get past. Not through strategy, not through persistence, not through being the perfect combination of available and elusive, but through the simple, irreducible fact of who you are. Something about you specifically reached something in them specifically that their deactivating strategies could not fully neutralize. That is not nothing. In the economy of an avoidance emotional life, that is enormous. Now let's talk about what this means for them going forward. because they are living with something that did not resolve cleanly. The love they tried to stop and couldn't, it doesn't disappear when the relationship changes shape or ends, or retreats into whatever ambiguous territory it currently occupies. It continues, in the same quiet, persistent, ambush-prone way it always did. Except now there may be less proximity to manage it against, less of the daily texture of your presence to either feed the feeling or give the management system something concrete to work with. What the avoidant is left with, in your absence or in the aftermath of the dynamic shifting, is the feeling without the context, the attachment without the object close enough to either build toward or defend against. And that is a specific kind of difficulty that they are, almost by definition, poorly equipped to navigate, because their coping system was built for managing feeling in the presence of a potential threat to their autonomy. It was not built for sitting with unresolved feeling in the absence of anything to manage. In that absence, something happens that the avoidant rarely anticipates and is frequently surprised by. The feeling, without the active work of deactivation to keep it at a managed level, tends to clarify, to become more legible to them. The distance that was supposed to resolve it instead reveals its full shape, and the full shape is often significantly more than they had been allowing themselves to acknowledge. This is frequently when avoidants circle back. Not always, but often, when the distance that was supposed to bring relief instead brings a clarity about the size of what they left behind that the deactivation strategy had been successfully obscuring. When the quiet is not peaceful but hollow, when the freedom they were supposedly protecting turns out to feel less like freedom and more like an absence that has a very specific shape, the shape of you. But here is where your own clarity becomes the most important variable in the room, because if they circle back, and they may with a quality of presence and honesty that they couldn't access before, you are not obligated to receive that return as resolution. You are not obligated to make their clarification your closure. Their realization that the love refused to be stopped does not automatically mean the conditions have changed. Does not automatically mean the internal work has been done. Does not automatically mean that this time the feeling will be allowed to build rather than managed back down to a safe level the moment intimacy reaches a certain threshold. What it might mean, if there is evidence, not just emotion of genuine change, is the beginning of a different conversation. One that starts from a place of honesty rather than the mutual performance of whatever the dynamic required of you both. One where they arrive with some acknowledgement of what the pattern cost you and a genuine reckoning with what they would need to do differently. One where the love being real is finally allowed to be the foundation of something rather than the secret kept beneath the surface of a managed distance. But that conversation requires something from you too. It requires you to have used the time, however long, however difficult, to do your own work. To have examined not just their patterns, but yours. To have understood not just why they pulled away, but why you stayed oriented towards someone who was consistently, if not deliberately, pulling away. To have built enough of your own ground that you can enter that conversation from a position of genuine wholeness rather than the relief of finally being reached for. Because the version of you that was waiting, the one checking the phone, monitoring the temperature, hoping, that version is not the version that conversation deserves. That version is still organized around their emotional weather, still locating safety in their approach rather than in your own ground. And a relationship that begins from that version of you, however much the love is real on both sides, will reconstruct the original dynamic with minor variations. Because the dynamic was not only about their avoidance, it was about the fit between their avoidance and your particular way of responding to it. Change the response, and the fit changes. Change the fit, and the whole thing has a different structural possibility. This is perhaps the least comfortable thing to sit with, the idea that your own patterns were participants in what unfolded. Not as blame, the word blame is too simple for something misnuanced, but as information, as the part of the equation that is actually yours to work with. Because you cannot change their architecture, you cannot do their internal work, you cannot want the healing for them more effectively than they want it for themselves. But you can change what you bring to the next chapter, of this or of anything that comes after. What does that change look like in practice? Not in theory, not as an abstract commitment to doing better, in the actual daily texture of how you move through your own life right now. It looks like developing a genuine tolerance for your own company. Not as a discipline, as a practice of slowly discovering that the interior you have been trying to fill with someone else's presence is actually already inhabited, that you are, when you stop fleeing yourself, remarkably interesting company, that the thoughts and feelings and perceptions you have been sharing outward, toward them, toward the analysis of the dynamic, toward the project of understanding them, those same resources, turned inward, produce a quality of self-knowledge that changes how you occupy your own life. It looks like noticing the moments when uncertainty feels like love, when the anxiety of not knowing produces an intensity that gets confused for depth of feeling, when the reaching itself becomes the point, when the pursuit is what feels most alive, and asking honestly whether that pattern is serving you or simply familiar. It looks like practicing the receipt of straightforward, consistent warmth without immediately finding it suspicious or insufficient, without testing it, without waiting for the withdrawal that your nervous system has been conditioned to expect, without interpreting the absence of drama as the absence of depth. It looks, in the end, like becoming someone whose love does not require uncertainty to feel real, whose attachment does not need the activation of anxiety to reach its full depth, whose capacity for intimacy does not live primarily in the charged space of almost connection, but in the quieter, more sustainable territory of actual presence. That becoming is the work. Not the work of fixing yourself. You are not broken. The work of completing yourself, of filling in the places that the dynamic left hollow, of reclaiming the parts of your emotional life that went quiet in the process of accommodating someone else's limits. And somewhere in the completion of that work, something shifts in how you hold the whole story. The avoidant who tried to stop loving you and something inside them refused. That story stops being primarily a story about them and starts being a story about what love is capable of surviving. Even inside a defended person, even inside a system built to neutralize it, even in the absence of the conditions that love is supposed to require in order to persist. Love, it turns out, is less obedient than we think. It does not follow the instructions of the nervous system. It does not respect the management strategies. It does not accept the rationalizations or the manufactured distance or the deactivating thoughts. It persists in the cracks. It shows up unannounced in ordinary moments. It refuses, with a stubbornness that is almost biological, to be reasoned out of existence. That is something worth knowing, not as an argument for any particular outcome, but as a fact about the nature of genuine feeling. When something real forms between two people, when genuine knowing occurs, when one human being sees another with any real accuracy, that connection does not dissolve cleanly just because one of the people involved has decided it should. It leaves a mark. It changes the interior landscape. It becomes part of the permanent record of what that person has felt and been moved by, and in their most honest moments cannot fully deny. You are part of their permanent record, whether or not that ever becomes something visible, whether or not it ever translates into the relationship it could have been, whether or not they ever find the words or the courage or the internal capacity to say clearly and without management what you already know they felt. You were real to them. The love was real. The refusal of that love to be stopped was real. And you, standing here now, having lived through the confusion and the distance and the particular loneliness of being loved at a volume you weren't always allowed to hear, you are also real. More fully, more honestly, more completely real than you were when this began. Because this experience, whatever else it cost, did not leave you smaller. It left you more honest, more clear-eyed, more specifically acquainted with both what you are capable of feeling and what you require in order to feel it sustainably. More intimate with your own interior than the easier path would ever have made you. That is not a consolation. That is not the silver lining offered in place of what you actually wanted. That is a real thing, a solid thing, something that belongs to you entirely and that no amount of their management or distance or deactivation could touch. The love that refused to be stopped, on their end, has its mirror on yours. The growth that refused to be prevented, the self that refused to be indefinitely minimized, the knowing that refused despite everything to be undone. That knowing is the ground you are standing on right now, and it is finally entirely yours. There is a version of this story that ends with them changing, with the realization cracking something open deep enough that they follow it all the way down, do the work, come back different, not performing difference, actually different, the nervous system slower to fire, the deactivating strategies less automatic, the capacity for presence genuinely expanded by the honest confrontation with what their pattern cost them and what it cost you. That version exists. It is not fantasy. It happens. People do change. Attachment styles are not life sentences. The wall can come down, not all at once, not without enormous sustained effort, but incrementally, genuinely, in ways that eventually become structural rather than cosmetic. But that version requires something from them that no amount of love on your part can supply. It requires the willingness to be uncomfortable in a way they have spent their entire life engineering around. To sit with the full weight of their own feeling without immediately reaching for the management strategy. To feel the grief of what their pattern has cost, not intellectually but in the body, in the place where all decisions live, and to let that grief do what grief does when it is not interrupted. To seek genuine help. Not the help of a new relationship providing fresh motivation. Professional help. The sustained, structured, boundaried process of examining the architecture with someone qualified to help dismantle and rebuild it. That is a significant undertaking. And the question of whether they are currently in that process, or whether the realization, however genuine, has remained at the level of feeling rather than descending into action, that question is one only their behavior over time can answer. Behavior over time, not declarations, not the quality of their feeling in the charged, vulnerable moment of realization, not the things they say when the grief of potential loss has temporarily lowered the wall. Behavior over time, under pressure, in the specific moments when the intimacy alarm fires and the old strategy becomes available, and they have to choose, consciously and repeatedly, something different. That choosing is the evidence. Everything else, the insight, the acknowledgement, the genuine emotion of a person who has finally felt the full size of what they were managing, all of that is the beginning of the doorway. The choosing is what makes it a door rather than a window. And doors, unlike windows, change the structural possibility of what can be built. You cannot know in any single conversation whether they are choosing. You cannot know it in the first week of changed behavior. You cannot know it in the warmth of reconnection when everything feels different because the emotional stakes are temporarily high and the motivation is temporarily acute. You can only know it in the accumulation of ordinary moments, in the way they handle the 15th Tuesday rather than the 1st, in what they do when the relationship has settled from its heightened emotional state back into the dailiness where patterns are most visible and most honest. This requires something from you that is genuinely difficult. It requires you to stay awake. Not suspicious. Awake. There is a difference. Suspicion is a defensive posture that is looking for evidence of what it already believes. Wakefulness is an open, discerning attention that is genuinely willing to be surprised in either direction. Willing to see change if change is real. Equally willing to see the pattern reasserting itself if that is what is actually happening, rather than explaining it away or absorbing it as the cost of loving someone who is trying. Trying matters. Imperfect progress is real progress. You are not looking for a person who has completed the work. That person does not exist because the work is never completed, only deepened. You are looking for a person who is genuinely in it, who takes responsibility without being asked, who notices when the old pattern activates and says so, rather than acting it out and leaving you to decode the behavior, who is building something internally that has evidence outside the moments of highest emotional motivation. That person, the one who is genuinely in the work, relates to their own avoidance differently than someone who has had a realization but not yet begun the process. The difference is subtle but feelable. It is the difference between someone who says, "I know I do this," with the slightly helpless quality of someone describing a fixed feature of themselves, and someone who says, "I noticed I was starting to pull away and I want to talk about it instead." One is insight. The other is agency. An agency directed at the right target with the right support is what change actually looks like from the inside. But let's come back to you, because you have been the consistent focus of this entire conversation. And there is a reason for that which goes beyond the surface subject of the avoidance experience. The reason is that your life, the one happening right now, in the present, independent of what they are or aren't doing, is the actual subject. The avoidant is the context. You are the content, and everything that has been said about their psychology, their patterns, their love that refused to be stopped, all of it has been, underneath its surface, a way of talking about what you have been living, what it has cost you, what it has taught you. And where it is pointing somewhere specific, not toward them necessarily, though it may include them if the conditions are genuinely different. It is pointing toward a version of intimacy that you have not yet fully inhabited, one that does not require you to be smaller or more managed or more carefully calibrated than your actual self, one where the love does not need to be decoded because it is expressed in a language you can actually hear. One where the warmth does not have a ceiling just above the height you need it to reach. You have a felt sense of what that looks like, not from experience of having it, though perhaps in glimpses. but from the negative space, from years of knowing precisely what it is not, from the accumulated specific detailed knowledge of what love feels like when it is being filtered through a defense system rather than offered freely. That negative knowledge is its own form of clarity. It has calibrated something in you, sharpened your ability to recognize the real thing when it arrives. And the real thing, when it arrives from whatever direction, in whatever form, will not feel the way you might expect. It will not feel like the intensity of the avoidant dynamic. It will not have the charged quality of almost connection, the particular electricity of pursuing someone who is perpetually just beyond reach. It will feel, at first, almost quiet, almost too easy, almost suspicious in its straightforwardness. Because your nervous system was calibrated on turbulence, on the hypervigilance of reading someone's emotional weather, on the constant low-grade alertness of wondering where you stood. And when a relationship comes along that does not require that vigilance, where you are not managing the temperature, not translating the silences, not bracing for the withdrawal that used to follow every moment of genuine closeness, the absence of that effort can initially feel like the absence of depth. It is not. It is the presence of safety. And safety, to a nervous system that has learned to associate love with uncertainty, takes time to trust, takes time to stop scanning for the catch, takes time to settle into without the part of you that was trained on intermittent reinforcement, waiting for the warmth to be revoked. That settling is its own process. It is not passive. It requires you to actively, consciously distinguish between the absence of drama and the absence of feeling. To notice when you are testing straightforward love because it doesn't feel familiar enough to feel real. To resist the pull toward dynamics that activate the old anxiety, because the anxiety, at least, is recognizable. You are allowed to want more than familiarity. You are allowed to want love that is not a puzzle. You are allowed to find the decoding exhausting rather than romantic. You are allowed to look back at the entire arc of what you navigated, the hope and the confusion and the grief, and the persistent, stubborn love that refused to be stopped on both sides, and decide that the next chapter will be built on different ground, not harder ground. Not more defended ground, just more honest ground, where what you see is what is actually there, where what is said reflects what is actually felt, where the love, if it is real, can be expressed at the volume it actually exists, rather than filtered down to the level that one person's fear can tolerate. That is not too much to want. That is the minimum that love, functioning as it is supposed to function, actually provides. And the fact that you have spent significant time inside something that could not provide it does not mean you have recalibrated your expectations downward. It means you have earned the right to be specific about what you are looking for, to name it clearly, to recognize it early, to choose it without apologizing for the choosing. The avoidant who tried to stop loving you and something inside them refused, they gave you something in spite of themselves. Not the relationship you deserved, not the consistent, fully expressed, openly given love that was always underneath the management, but something real nonetheless. The experience of being genuinely felt by someone who is fighting their own feeling. The knowledge that you are the kind of person who gets past defenses not by force, but by simply being who you are. The confirmation that what you carry, your particular way of seeing people, of staying present, of loving with genuine depth, is not invisible, is not wasted, reaches people even when they are working hard not to be reached. That is yours. Carry it forward. Not as a story about them, as a story about you, about what you are capable of, about the quality of connection you are able to create and sustain, even under the most resistant conditions. About the fact that your love, when it is real, is the kind that refuses to be stopped too. Because here is the full circle of it. The thing that this entire conversation has been building toward without announcing it. They tried to stop loving you, and something inside them refused. And you, in a mirror of that same stubbornness, that same refusal of genuine feeling to obey the management strategy, you tried to stop hoping, tried to stop reaching, tried to accept what was being shown to you and stop wanting it to be different. And something inside you refused too, for longer than was comfortable, for longer than was perhaps wise. Because something real was present, and real things are hard to release before they have run their full course. That refusal, yours, was not weakness, it was not delusion. It was the same fundamental quality that refused on their side. The same recognition, at the level beneath strategy and self-protection, that something genuine was present, and genuine things deserved to be taken seriously. You took it seriously, perhaps more seriously than the circumstances ultimately warranted. But the taking seriously, The willingness to feel fully, to stay present with difficulty, to refuse the easy exit of dismissing what was real. That quality is not a liability. It is the thing that makes you capable of the depth of connection you are looking for. In the right conditions, with the right person, at the right level of mutual readiness, that same quality becomes the foundation of something that does not need to be managed or decoded or endured. Something that simply, finally, with the ease of two people who have both done their work and both chosen to be present, builds.